All right. Now, before I get started on the Active Directory Management Framework, a little bit about me. As I was already introduced, the name is Fred, not Friedrich Weinmann or something, like just Fred. The other part is, I don't know who got the idea about that name, probably my parents or something like that. Anyway, I'm a premier field engineer working at Microsoft, doing lots of security and automation. Main focus is Active Directory, but there's a broad field where people just kind of, oh, we need PowerShell. Oh, there's this PowerShell guy. So the automation part is slowly taking over. I have a few non-PowerShell related hobbies, mostly reading fun things, and I maintain two main projects. One of them is the PowerShell Framework project, and the other one is the Active Directory Management Framework. The latter one is something we're going to go a lot more deep dive today. The first one accelerates your coding, makes your coding life more convenient, massive logging and other capabilities in there to help improve your code at less time taken. All right. When we talk about automating against Active Directory, let's think, I'm not talking about general user creation workflows or things like that, which, let's be honest, at larger companies is usually completely handled by some identity management solutions. No, but when we define our Active Directory topology, like what organizational units create security delegation, security group policies, maybe schema extensions, and whatnot, how do we do this? Well, mostly either we do it by hand, which is kind of error prone, especially when you first have a development environment, trying to deploy it to that, and try to deploy the exact same settings to your production. So manual labor by hand, no, we really shouldn't be doing this. And you probably are also not inclined to do that if you joined our call today. So this kind of asks for PowerShell. But what do we do then? Well, we write a script that does it for us. Need some new organization units? Sure, I think we all can code that. Need to create some schema extension? I think also all of us could make do that, but speaking from personal experience, that's a pitfall waiting for you for some very obscure oddities that if you don't have the background, you'll spend quite a bit of time researching. So we write a script, and we write another script, and a friend of us at a fellow company, at another company, writes the same script, or at least a similar script. I mean, you can't really reinvent creating organizational units. That's kind of a done deal, but still you need to customize for your own purposes. So this costs a lot of money, and it takes a lot of time. Now, you might argue time is money, but think about it from a security engineer perspective. Yes, I bill the hours to the customer. That's money. But the time spent is also, at the same time, the time delay, the latency between having a need and realizing that need, which, for example, means your reaction speed in a security incident. If you need to first write a script that takes you a week to code, well, by that point, the attacker might already have won. Not so good. And then when we've spent the time and the money and everybody's happy that it's created, then there comes this most evil bastard. We call it documentation. Writing good documentation is hard, and I have yet to see truly self-documenting code that is more than 3 lines of script. Yeah, this has a few other consequences. Working against Active Directory like this, like writing a custom script for everything. And that is, first of all, often enough, it's the wrong person writing the script. What the hell is the wrong person writing the script? Well, you see, imagine you've got a larger organization, and the person writing the script to automate Active Directory is probably going to be an Active Directory admin. Same as somebody writing a script against Exchange is probably going to be an Exchange admin. So we have this subject matter experts writing those scripts, but often enough, people are not actually that deep into the technical details of making it work right in PowerShell. For example, as part of the solution, we added analysis like testing the current state. And we realized that the solution that the customer had been using for literally dozens of forests, creating them, had a bug. It had a bug and nobody noticed, and it was a security delegation bug. Just a teeny weeny one where everybody of not all that privileged group actually was granted full control over all group policies, including the ones governing tier 0 domain controllers, domain admins. This kind of accidents due to a bug in the code, not good. Of course, we also produce redundant code if you have to reinvent the wheel every single time, or at least cross-organization what our fellows produce. Because if we only write custom code for our specific use case, sharing it in a form that is valuable to others is difficult. But at the same time, that means people keep writing the same thing. So we wanted to kind of get away from this. Then we've got a problem of incompatibility. One script cannot really be incompatible with another script if they run in separate processes, unless they work against the same service. Imagine you're doing bulk delegation and are assuming a certain organizational unit structure, but another script messed with you of that, broke your script, maybe interrupted it, terminating error, can't find the organizational unit you want to place delegation on. Maybe they broke in some other way the security scheme of the first one. And finding those is basically manual labor. If you've got multiple scripts working against the same service, you don't have a way to automate any collision detection. You can't like write a pester test, will this script collide with the other script? It just doesn't work. We've got a high maintenance effort, of course, because we have got lots of custom code that we now need to maintain or leave to go into obsolescence and create a new script, see redundant code. And of course, this delays all of our projects. If you've got like a major migration and you first need to write a script, that just adds to the project time. We needed a solution to this. Ta-da! The Active Directory Management Framework. The main purpose for us was basically to stop forcing the IT department to actually write code. So instead of like creating a new user like this, switch this to provide configuration instead. This is a simple JSON entry. The entire framework has a management solution that expects JSON. You can replace that with your own data format if JSON is something that you feel is really irksome. I'm not going to prevent you from using XML if you're masochistic enough to use it, but you're free to. It's just not recommended, really. All right. So how does this look like? You provide any number of settings in a JSON format in a specific folder structure. And of course, there's tooling to prevent you having to do this by hand. Manual labor violates my religion. We don't do manual labor. But basically, we turn a number of settings we prefer. Can be a single one setting. It can be dozens, hundreds, thousands, whatever strikes your fancy. Into any number of files. For example, we've got here one organizational units file. We could at the same time have 10 JSON files that all define organizational units. We don't have to put them all into a single file. And this qualifies for a growing number of aspects of Active Directory. So you can define access rules, ACL, group policy links, group policy objects, group memberships, group security delegation, schema extension, sites, subnets, site links, all without writing a single line of code anymore. So we can define all these nice objects. And for your reference, this is an ongoing project with the customer where I've got like 1 week of development every single month just to add more features to this. Which, by the way, is pretty much a dream job, being able to, do what you would be happy to do on your own time if you had the time on the clock for the customer and get billed for that and paid for that. Pretty awesome. Okay. We have lots of settings, and these are all deployed in something that we call a context. A context is like a big container for configuration settings. In reality, as we saw on the previous slide, this is a folder structure with a bit of more extras to that. Why didn't we just call it a configuration set? Because in addition to all the settings that we deploy, we also have the ability, for example, to define dependencies. That is, we can have more than one context, and we can require one context to depend on another context. Just as an example, you could have a default configuration for your domains, and then have a set of separate configuration contexts, one per environment. So you have a specific context for development, another for production, another for quality assurance environment if you've got multiple Active Directory environments, because not every setting is the same. Just for example, IPsec rules. They're going to be environment specific. You can't roll the production IPsec rules onto QA. Security is going to kill you if you do. So you can make multiple contexts be mutually exclusive. For example, you could prevent the production context to be loaded at the same time as the QA or dev context, because it can't be in both environments at the same time. We have additional meta information, some of which we'll cover later on. Let's say you've got a Contoso default context and have 3 environment-specific contexts, each of which depend on the Contoso default. In the production forests, we also have a production environment. You also have a Hyper-V forest dedicated to hosting the virtualization platform, which only exists there. Independent of these forest-specific contexts, we could also like have a differentiation between, are we in a root domain or is it a child domain? Are we using a break glass account, which might want you to enable different processes and procedures, configuration settings? And you can freely combine them. Now, this is a lot of configuration sets, and we want to prevent that users accidentally assign the wrong configuration to the current forest, or that's a lot of potential for things to go wrong. So we need to provide a certain user experience to this, which we'll be coming to. But basically, we can add multiple settings, multiple entries, configuration entries from the context as we please, and one context can override a specific setting of another context. And yes, you can define the order in which this whole thing applies. But at the same time, this means you can scan your configuration sets whether there's any overlap. And that means you can basically write a pester test whether your configuration is all right. Now, about this preventing error thing, depending on what context you deploy, we auto-generate a user interface selection for each domain that you contact that forces you to pick what is the current configuration set. And you can deploy some logic that pre-enables, that auto-detects what context probably should be loaded to prevent another aspect of user interaction that could fail. All right, last slide. Then you have survived everything I have with PowerPoint, because really I really hate PowerPoint, but in order to introduce like the architecture of what we're talking about, concepts, for that we just can't do that really in code as well. But last slide. As you might imagine, this whole thing is not the simple most module thing ever written. The primary module is called ADMF. And that's really all you need to do to install it. Install module ADMF and you have everything at hand. The ADMF module manages the workflow implementation and the configuration. So all the settings, all this converting JSON into data that it works on happens in ADMF. Also the user interface and a lot of other fancy tools. Underneath the ADMF, there are 3 separate components: domain controller management, domain management, and forest management. Every single component that we manage is actually implemented in one of these 3 modules. For example, the logic that implements group management happens in domain management, of course. Access rules also in domain management. And site management, on the other hand, forest management, because that is forest-wide. Basically, anything that happens in the schema and configuration naming contexts is handled by the forest management. Domain controller management is still a bit of a lightweight, but it handles, among other things, new domain controller deployment, which you can also configure and deploy using WinRM only. So you can, as long as you've got a WinRM connection, and if it's using the Hyper-V bus, you can deploy an entire forest using your default configuration settings. Underneath those, there's some implementation API logic that is partially assumed. For example, we require the Active Directory module because, I'll be honest, I'm not masochistic enough to try to reinvent all the things they have in there. It's reasonably robust. We might argue a little bit about user friendliness since they introduced dynamic parameters, but for all its sins, it does what it's supposed to do. This is not a listed dependency. It is assumed that you have the module available. Otherwise, it will notice that you don't and tell you red stuff about how bad you were. We also require the Active Directory Security module, ADSEC, which is another by me for security and especially owner management. And for all things group policy, you must have the group policy module, but mostly that's on the destination server. And all of that ties into the PowerShell framework module as the implementing infrastructure module, which allowed us to finish the whole thing at a pretty insane speed, actually. It also means every single action that you do, every change that you do, every test that you run is logged using the PowerShell framework module, which means you can attach it to pretty much any logging backend that your company might require of you. So much so good. We're talking about 8 PowerShell modules here that are playing together with each other. I hope you don't have any major problems getting that many past security. Well, Active Directory and group policy modules are already on board, so you only have to explain how you get 6 modules into your secure environment. But I can at least guarantee all of them are out of my own hands, and I know they are actually good. That's it. No more PowerPoint. Okay, what I have set up now is, didn't see that. What I've set up now is to Windows 2019 server. This is my admin forest, like my Bastion forest, that I use as an administrator to administrate all my other forests. And we also have the managed DZ, which is a newly created domain controller, root domain controller of a new forest, there's nothing in there. This thing is virtual land. There has been nothing configured. We don't have another user. We don't have any organizational units. And if we're taking a look at the group policy, you can see there is not really much to see here. Only the 2 default group policy objects. So we have a new forest to manage. Let's see what we can do. All right. Okay. Imported the module and let's see what we get here. Well, we talked about context, so let's see what configuration we have available here. That wasn't supposed to happen. Okay, the demo gods are not quite as angry with me as I was afraid. Okay, we don't have any contexts defined yet. This is the folder where you're supposed to turn up. So let's create a new context. The first thing we need to do is we need to give it a name. Common naming advice, make it something descriptive, don't add a white space. So let's just go ahead and call it contour to default. The store is the folder where we're going to write it there. So wait, this is the loading order. It's a numeric value. The higher the value, the later it is going to be imported, which generally means the higher the number, the greater the precedence, because the last setting wins in case of a conflict. So I'm going to give it a very low number. And I'm going to add a description. And since I'm absolutely Wayne, my name must be included here. Anything else? No. Oh, yes, there is one thing. I want the default access rules in there. What the hell are the default access rules? When you deploy an Active Directory domain, not everything is as it's supposed to be, or as the schema says it should be. So for every single object, so let's say you create a user, you get a few access rule permissions on that user. And where do they come from? In a schema, there's a setting like this is the default permission for the following user. However, there are a lot of system objects and default objects that have more access rules assigned to them as the schema would say that they should have. So by creating the default access rules, we've got like everything a default domain has in addition to what is defined in the schema. So for example, it doesn't complain about the domain controllers having special privileges. Okay, and there we are. This is all we really needed to do, like this one line. Let's maybe add this to the notes here. So we have the context JSON, which governs the meta information we talked about. And under items. So Let's take a look. With setADMF context, we select which context should be enabled. And if we want this with a user interface, we use interactive. And we need to specify the domain we want to work against. Let's just use contoso.com for now. As we can see, we have one context, and it automatically generated this user interface. And if we now select Contoso default, it will load it. Whatever that loaded actually just now meant. That's all nice, but this is the default context. I mean, if we run this, shouldn't it be like checked by default if it's our default? It would make more sense. So the script block is executed when this UI is generated for every single context to determine whether it should be checked or not. False, no, true, yes. You can connect to the domain, you get the connection information, and you could, for example, you could determine whether this is a root domain or a child domain and check or uncheck the corresponding context. Now, for the default one, we go to easy root. And we just tell it to always be true. And now it's checked by default. All right. Let's add a bit more fun. Let's go with environment-specific ones. Let's give this one a 50. And now here's one parameter we've previously skipped, the group parameter. That determines what how the user interface will build them. And I'm going to make this mutually exclusive to QA and dev. And this is going to depend on Contoso default. Let's go ahead and update a few more. And if we now go to interactive menu, you can see all these contexts and you get meta information, which is probably a bit hard to see right now, but basically you see what it's depending on, what it is mutually exclusive with. And as you can see, if at the moment I check one of them, the other two get grayed out. If I disable Contoso default, no environment can be selected because they all depend on Contoso default being available. And this is where the environment part came in. All right. This is how we build up our context. And now we can go into any of these and apply various settings. And as mentioned, it will by default create access rules for all kind of objects, which shows us one of the other features. We automatically provide name insertion for placeholders. You automatically get quite a few of them just when by connecting to a domain. You can, depending on the context, create your own. For example, you could create a placeholder for the environment you're in if you've got environment-specific organizational units or organizational units that are tied to their environment name, group memberships, security delegations, whatever. All right. And that's pretty much all to creating these things. Now, there are lots of properties here, but how does that actually happen? How do you know how that is supposed to look? Well, for one thing, we've got when you look at the currently imported modules, you can see you've got the domain management module I was previously talking about. And they have quite a few commands. And for every single folder that you see here, there's a corresponding register call here. For example, there's a register DM access rule. And every single JSON property maps to one of these parameters. So by looking up these commands, you can get more details on that. And all of them have, of course, no, I don't want one update help. Have full description for every single parameter, like what it means, how to use it, what the gotchas are. Now, that is one way to go about this. I do know that command line help is not universally the best tool for documentation. It's good to have, and I take a pain to actually make sure all of the commands have them. My tests will not succeed. The publish will refuse if I don't write my help. But there needs to be something better. So we've got a website called admf.one. And besides getting started documentation and everything, we have detailed documentation on a lot of aspects. Still needing to add a few more times. Documentation is never quite up to date. But what we strive for, which most of the components already have, is a short description like what the component is all about, how the configuration could look like, and a PowerShell script that allows you to basically record what's currently already deployed in an Active Directory and take that as an example, as a template to build your own configuration from. So we try to always give you the tools to make this less painful, at least, especially for the initial deployment parts. Also, here as well, every single property is probably explained with a lot of text, lots of blah, blah. Another thing, for all the settings, we have got an online command reference for every single command. And before you're wondering, no, I do not manually write those. This is auto-generated. I actually have a CI/CD pipeline that will generate this on every single update. What's behind the whole thing? If we look at the associated GitHub repository, the entire website is hosted in GitHub Pages. This is the Git repository for my website. It is automatically generated from here. And I automatically place the markdown files. Every single file is a markdown file here. So if you want to have a cheap way to document your own PowerShell projects, irrespective of Active Directory or not Active Directory, GitHub Pages. Doesn't cost me a thing to have HTTPS certificate protected websites. Admittedly, I need to buy the domain name from a domain host, but I'll say admf.one was like $19 per year. I somehow will survive this cost. Okay. Okay, that was the managed domain. Let's go back to the thing. Now, building a fully valid working configuration set is a bit of a pain. So I have already taken care of that by preparing them, which leads us to the context store. The context store is the path where it looks for context settings. This is backed by the PowerShell framework configuration system, which means you can register additional paths, and it will automatically pick up all the contexts stored within that path. What does this mean for you in real life? You could have a network share with your configuration and deploy a group policy that every single admin uses the same settings from there, no matter on what machine. Problem with that, or potential problem with that, means, well, if you've got a network problem, if the network is down, you can't really use it to fix it. You could have a module register a new store on import. So you could have all your context in a module, all your configuration settings, and maybe some custom logic you want to deploy as individual custom functions. And you could just deploy that, have that module depend on ADMF, install module, your module, and all your tools, all your configuration is on the machine, import module on your module, and all the configuration is available. The version number and everything. Okay, I have prepared a few extra settings. So now we have in the store demo, the name here, 2 more settings. Setting sets. One of them is a default permission set, and one of them includes tier 0 start. Okay. First of all, we need to manage this highly secure virgin new domain, which is totally not a virtual machine that I just reset the snapshot on. And I'm, of course, using not the default automated labs password instead of a highly complex one. OK. Now, this is one of the most important aspects of ADMF. For every single setting that we define, we can run a test to see whether we are in the desired state. Then I can run an invoke to fix anything that is not. And afterwards, I can again run a test to see whether everything actually vanished as it was supposed to. If anybody of you now has this mental line going through your head, wait a sec, isn't this desired state configuration for Active Directory? You're not wrong. You're also not right. There's somewhere in the gray zone in between. There is a dedicated DSC resource for Active Directory, and it is very, very good. If you already have DSC deployed in your enterprise, actually the DSC resource for it might be the better choice. Not sure. I did not do a full feature map. The thing is, I can go to a customer or to an organization with the ADMF and have them running within a single day. I've got one long-term customer that I deployed it to recently. It took 4 hours to teach them how to use it. They did not have to change any workflows, the way they managed IT, and it did not conflict with any other department, which is the problem with desired state configuration. Your organization first needs to go through the entire DevOps, the DevOps change of mindset. The way the people work needs to change before the desired state configuration really becomes a thing. And the Active Directory department is usually the last department that gets to that point. So traditionally, the DSC part was not really compatible with, or was hard to adopt. With ADMF, you can adopt it in very short time, and at the same time, learn and adopt a few DevOps practices as you first start getting the value, and then see how these new practices actually help you, because they're not a prerequisite, they just make things easier. All right, we have a new forest. Let's see how compliant it is with my desired configuration. And there's one command for domain and one for forest. So I can run the test for domain settings, or I can run the test for forest-wide settings. There's not yet one for domain controller because we don't have any specific setting tests except for the initial deployment. But as soon as we have something for domain controllers, there will be a test ADMF domain controller. So we want to speak with deadpuppies.contour.com. We need custom credentials. And here's a fun thing, the options parameter. We can combine any single setting. So we don't need to run all domain tests. We could just run access rules. Let's do that. Okay, we never talked with deadpuppies.contoso.com, so we don't have any configuration selected for that. And see what's happening here. We have, in fact, received a pop-up that allows us to select the context. So Contoso default is no longer the correct one because that is the one we defined here. Instead, from the demo storage, let's pick Contoso, and let's not care about tier 0. We're not yet at the point that we want to deploy tier 0. Okay. Now, of course, since I just had to use access rules for this, we get to wait. What's happening here? The first time we scan access rules, it scans the schema of the target forest and determines the default access rules for every single object type. Because otherwise, it cannot really determine whether the current security delegation is a default delegation or something it needs to fix. Imagine the overhead you'd have if you had to define every single default settings for every single object. All right. Everything all right. There's nothing wrong. Well, I'm not quite sure I should be happy with that. So let's just scan all. There we go. What can we see here? It will create a few organizational units. And it would create 3 groups. And there are 2 more groups that are actually not in its desired state, that are recent addition. So it is now trying to delete them, which is fine with me. I don't need these specific groups, and I don't really need to protect them in this case. So I'll just go ahead and tell it, yeah, do it. I love destructive commands. Now, you could manually, individually run each step, but the default processing order is configured to be non-destructive as it can be. So I recommend always using invoke ADMF domain and using common sense for settings. For example, we've got 2 organizational units steps. To begin, we create organizational units that do not yet exist. And only after processing everything else that we actually start deleting them. Or most of the other things. Why is that? First, we create new organizational units, and then if groups or users or any other of these objects are still in the old organizational units, they would have a move action defined up here as a change because they're in the wrong organizational unit based on the desired state. So it will first move them to the new organizational unit, and then the old ones can be deleted. And don't you worry, this step fails for any organizational units that still has child items. So you cannot accidentally delete your Exchange servers. I considered leaving this in as an Easter egg, but I kind of got the impression that people might not quite catch my humor. But let's see what happened in the other domain. Now, this is a recently managed domain, and we have lots of additional organizational units in here, and we probably also have some groups laying around. There we go. So everything where it's supposed to be. Let's see what happened here. By the way, I know I talk a lot and I talk long, but still anybody here?
Yes, we're here.
Sounds
And to listen you.
excellent. Excellent. So as you can see here now, the test finds everything is in the desired state. I think that's pretty good. So now we're ready to deploy our T0 environment. However, as you probably noticed, after the first time, it never again prompted us for which context we want, because it already noticed that puppies and didn't see anything now. This is one problem I need to fix, which is going to be one of the next releases. It is specific to the domain controller it contacts. So we need to target the same. This is deterministic. It will by default, unless you change the configuration or explicitly target another domain controller, pick the PDZ emulator. That is particular of relevance when it comes to group policy, because if you change the group policies using the UI, when an admin interacts using the user interface, the group management console also connects to the PDZ emulator, and that way everybody works against the same server, and we don't have any out of sync problems and collisions when two people changed things differently on different domain controllers. Okay, let's update the setting, and I want Contoso and tier 0 now. Not only Contoso, I'm also adding tier 0. And the moment we do this, it has a lot more to do because now we have more settings. And we have a few more tier 0 organizational units. It needs more groups. We don't have the Active Directory object that we assign access rules to, because we've got some delegation here. We need to create a few more group policy objects, and we need to update GP links. Now on this machine, I must admit, there is, this is a bit of legacy thing. It's trying to delete the GP link for the default domain policy, which is going to fail because you can't delete it, at least not without disabling system protection. But that's no longer an issue in the current version. So still, anyway, I don't. We want to create organizational units. We want to create groups. We want access rules, and we want screw it. I'm just going to do it. And yes, the invoke command supports what if and confirm. Okay, how does group policy work? Most group policy actions require win or m to the target machine, because we copy the group policy objects and import them on the domain controller itself. Why? The group policy module doesn't support custom credentials, and that just won't work. You couldn't use it like you couldn't use a break glass account to do things. Okay, we performed a lot of mayhem. Let's see what happened here now. Did I manage to break anything? I might have managed to break something. Excellent. Okay, first of all, let's refresh our structure. We now have here some tier 0 delegation. And the moment I actually enable advanced features, I also get to see the tier 0 delegation thingy. There we go. So here we are, and tier 0 admins have full control over the tier 0 structure. No, that's cool. That's great. I think I want something more. Let's go with, oh yeah. I'm going to now create Max. Max is a great guy, but he really doesn't have any idea how security and compliance works. So using the administrator account, he creates his own user object and assigns that user object direct permissions to the tier 0 structure. This is, of course, now a compliance problem because he, changed security delegations in a non-supported way. And if we do a refresh here, and we can see I actually managed to do something I shouldn't have been able to. Did I mention that this is kind of risky and you really, really should check your configuration whether you really, really want to do this before you break more things? Wasn't me. And we deployed tier 0 configuration to server and clients. Now let's see, what did they do here with logon restrictions? I think we really need to update this. So I'm now going into some configuration using the user interface. And I think I definitely need to disallow basic authentication as the client. By the way, all of you who have to deal with Exchange Online or the Security and Compliance Center in Azure, the remoting there uses modern authentication if you use the Exchange Online Management module. However, to the WinRM client, this looks like basic authentication. So if you've got problem with connecting to Exchange Online, because weird stuff happens on your screen and that you can't use basic auth, you're a victim to this configuration setting. Okay, we had some manual changes. Let's see whether our system catches those. And voila, it detects that this access rule has been messed with, and it needs to delete this delegation. It also detects that somebody modified our logon restrictions group policy object and would now reapply our current settings. And it detects the GP lengths we manually recreated. However, it did not detect the user object we created. Why? We skip any tests for which we haven't configured any configuration, and since we did not define any user object, it did also not check for undesired user objects. So we need to define at least one user object. And then it will be happy to remove this admin account that was not supposed to be there. All right. That's basically how you manage settings with ADMF. You incrementally build up configuration sets, mapping your organization. You can deploy them against your test environment, see how it works out. Use the same configuration setting and deploy it against a production environment, but testing it only and just see what would it do. And if you're happy to apply them, do that afterwards.
Fred?
Yep.
Is there any way to take our current configuration in using your modules?
Yes, there is, but there is no centralized way to do that yet. Simply put, what we're currently working as step one is having for every single aspect a tool like this. For example, here I've got an entire function written just to parse the GP-link configuration out of an organizational unit. Long term, this is not going to be an immediate goal, but it's on my definitely want to have list, is that I not only have a test and invoke domain, I also want to have an export domain. Yeah. That will basically take the current full configuration, everything, and dump it into a configuration context. At the moment, this is a at least per category thing with snippets here. Not all of them have yet those, even those snippets. Working on that.
Okay, so if I get it correctly, it's basically a kind of DSC module that sets and unsets and creates, but with the additional stuff like ACLs, like GPO links, etc. But the thing is, is there any? I mean, could you show how we create the data, the JSON files? Is there any simple way to create those entries, or you have to know your stuff in and out to create the JSON for, I don't know, the organizational unit with the ACLs, with etc.?
Basically, there at the moment, you for some of them you need to know your stuff. We're still there that we don't have automated tooling for everything. But let's take, for example, the GP link. We have 2 GP links that we need to add to the configuration. So let's go with that for now as an example.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I copied the function, and now we have here some examples. This will not work yet. Not quite. So let's go here. Okay. What we need here is the domain. We need the credential that we have on the $cred. Then we need the same thing here. And the credentials. So let's first go with that. Oh, yeah, I might kind of want to specify credentials here. And if I don't specify that, or at least fix this one. No, these are all the delegations that we have, except for the domain controller, the domain object itself. Now, we already have all the other ones, but it was complaining about the domain controllers. So let's select the first one. And convert to JSON. And then we just go set clipboard. And we need to go to this one. Let's create a new file. Domain.file.json, creating an array, pasting it. With that, the default domain controllers policy is now in place. And since I already know how that's supposed to look, now we also have the default domain policy. Precedence is the link order, which in this case, since we only have one object linked each time, in each case, let's take a look here. We only have one Yes, I know. Thank you very much. We have only got one linked here and one linked here. Link order is okay the way it is. Okay, we have that defined. Now there is one thing we need to do, which is unintuitive. If I now say, hey, let's select these contexts, it instantly returned. It didn't do anything as well because it knows it already has the context imported. It's not going to re-import them.
So there should be some kind of force box that you can check, and then it will not care that the context is already selected. It would just re-import it.
Yep, that would be great. Now, if I had that implemented yet, that would be cool. If somebody finds an issue for me, this is something rather simple to implement. It's kind of, do I remember this after the session and my later workload? But if I remember it, I will add that. But what we can do in the meantime is we just select the different configuration set and then select the previous ones again. And now it took a bit longer and that works. So let's go with test ADMF domain. And it detected that the GP links are now in order. So let's update those two and fix that. And that is the way we, at the customer, build our all our configuration sets, and we literally have thousands of settings. We wrote some snippets to record them, to be kind of lazy. In some cases, we wrote them down and they're on the website. In other cases, it was kind of impromptu and we haven't yet done so. Haven't recreated them yet. So that's partly still pending. But you just iterate until all the tests, the domain is the way you want it to, and the tests all say it's in a desired state. And that's one JSON entry at a time. We spent a few days working on a highly complex configuration set that would work against about 300 forests. Yes, 300 forests, not domain forests.
Okay, so let me get it right. Right now, before you implemented those two basic policies into the JSON file, it was not testing any group policy links because there was nothing in the configuration. And once you created those two JSON entries, it deleted anything that exceeds for the domain controller links and the base policy links because they were not configured, right?
It would have, yes. Actually, that was on the first test run before we did this. Here we already have GP links because the tier 0 GP link definition links the group policies to the following 3 organizational units here. So it already detected them, deleted them, and I manually recreated them because unlinking them is a bad idea. Then it again detected them. After manually creating them again, it detected them again that they should be deleted because they're not part of the configuration, which we now changed. So at this point, it no longer asks us to delete them.
Okay, could you show the current state of the VCs in the GUI?
Oh, sure. The default domain policy is linked as it's supposed to be. And if we're looking at the security delegation here, we will find that the admin no longer is on the listed privileged identities here.
Okay.
So let's create a new setting.
So one more thing, are there any live examples of, I mean, you said that there are no PowerShell commandlets to create those configs, but any live examples how we could configure each of those settings? I mean, each user, each group, each OU, and things like that. And just in a simple example of, I'm not talking about the ACLs for those, because they are the stuff you need to know, but the object itself, yeah, kind of this.
That exists for many of them, not quite all of them yet.
Mm-hmm.
But they exist.
Okay.
This is one of those examples where it doesn't exist yet. This is one where we had now. Users is, for example, this.
Mm-hmm.
And for each of these properties, you can find a description at the bottom here.
Yeah.
Whether it's optional, what the default value is. Old names, by the way, is if you want to rename objects.
So as I can see it's an advanced DSC without the hassle to learn the DSC syntax. You just need to create the configuration. So it abstracts the configuration from the DSL language itself. And all you need to do is to create the configs or the JSON, right?
Yes. And it has the the configuration management built in, so you can combine multiple sets, which is one of those DSC things which doesn't work well if you don't have all the DevOps DSC configuration super workflow thing already implemented and lived.
Mm-hmm.
This handles that for you.
And because it's using PS Framework, I can log anything to file, event, SQL, or Azure Log.
Yes.
Where do you find time to build stuff like that?
As I kind of mentioned, I built this on the customer time. They
I know,
paid
but
me to build
it would take me like 2 years to create just the scaffolding of what you did in here.
Well, we're currently at about 11 weeks.
3 months. How many people working on it?
Me.
Get out of here.
Well, that's as much as I have to show on the Active Directory Management framework, or at least as much as I prepared. If there are no further questions on this, I can do a little bit on Fred's latest toys and hand it off after that.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. So you can deploy group policies. With that, can you deploy also the settings? So, for example, you have a group policy that creates network shares or so. Can you, can you tell your framework to set that in the group policy?
Yes, no.
Okay.
Yeah, I know that's really helpful here. Basically, first of all, what you really want, no, not yet. It's on the to-do list. Okay. It's depending on another engagement work project that has gotten delayed with the huge disruption and requirement for automation that Corona recently introduced. So at the moment, it does not have this translation table thing where you can dynamically do that. It's on the to-do list. Actually, my final end game scenario has you defining group policy settings on a per setting basis in configuration, rather than having a full group policy backup object.
Okay.
What you already can do in the dev, and not in the dev branch, in the feature branch I'm currently working on, which is pending release this week, is registry settings. That all the things you can deploy with setGP registry setting. That these are definable outside of the GPO backup, but as part of your thing, including dynamic logic to calculate settings from the target domain.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
How do you plan to be able to configure this by setting by setting if there are tons and tons and tons of possibilities? I mean, do you have any translation, or do you?
Actually, part of first of all, what I'm planning to do is fully implement the group policy API, the way that the API that is used by the user interface. I am planning to support ADMX parsing and importing from a deployed group policy object. So you design your group policy in the user interface, then you run a command against it and import it into convert it into JSON entries, and then you can do placeholders for names and things like that.
Okay.
That is the end game. It's not gonna be tomorrow.
Yeah, that's nice,
Okay.
because I tried it. And I export a group policy into his folder structure, and then I try to import it. And after 10 times of importing, it failed because something is broken. Then you have to export it again and import it. Then suddenly it works again. So I I hope that you can implement that. So it will be a great thing.
In the meantime, for group policy migration, it's not fully robust yet. GPO tools is another module of mine.
Okay.
So I wanted the thing that when you imported the GPO at the first place, is it using the GPO tools that you mentioned?
And now we're getting into terminology issues. The PowerShell module that is literally called GPO tools.
I know. But I know that you mentioned, in PSCon that you are building a tool that will allow you to migrate the GPOs between domains, because it's not easy by default by Microsoft.
Yep.
So you're using this kind of tricks in here as well to get
No, not yet.
Okay. So we have to
is...
create a GPO within the domain. You cannot use, for example, a default set of domain policies and then import into like 12 forests at a time.
Yep.
Okay.
And you use export ADMF GPO to generate the GPO backup and the associated configuration.
And can I get this, for example, from my dev environment and then import the GPO into a prod environment?
Yes.
Okay.
It just won't do any name resolution. So if you've got a network share pointing at like the domains as well, it will still point at a dev. And now is the problem. If you now manually update that, it will detect that a group policy was modified and will try to roll back.
Okay.
So for some things it works well, but for some policy types it does not work well at all at the moment.
Okay.
No limitation.
Okay. Okay.
Another feature that we're working on, which is a per object thing, is that you can update individual results and not all of them at once. For example, that you could just say, hey, let's update these 3 GP links, but not those 2. That's another thing that is pending, but not going to be tomorrow.
Any roadmap or timetable that you have defined by the customer by when you have to finish all the must-have features?
No, we do a best effort every single month. Like,
okay.
What are we going to work on this month? For example, one of the other things that's going to be coming is updating the NT-auth store with the domain-wide trusted certificates, or forest-wide trusted certificates, which is another thing that we had required. So the feature map kind of jumps all over the place what the current customer priority is. So what I do on customer time is hard to predict. I also work on it in my own spare time sometimes, but not as much as I'd like. I generally more work on the documentation side when I can make the time for it.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I mean, knowing you, the next PSCon 2021, it will be nearly finished, nearly polished.
Let's see how it develops. For example, we don't know how customer priorities will change given the current situation. Budgetary constraints that might happen.
Sorry, you mentioned it's a big customer. How many forests in there? How many domains?
More than 300 forests. More than 500,000 users. And just for reference, previously they were using their old automation suite by RDPing into the domain controller and having it deployed by System Center.
What?
They deployed the current script solution using System Center. Then they would RDP into the domain controller and execute it locally.
Is it even possible at that scale? I mean, how many domain admins do they have?
Oh, too few. They, of course, had scaling problems. A schema extension update would take 2 years. By which time it would be obsolete, of course.
Okay.
You might kind of notice how enthusiastic they were about, hey, we've got this new PFE that actually knows PowerShell.
Yeah, I imagine you're being torn apart different directions.
It's a fun life, but on-site at a customer, they've got dozens of PFEs all over. And suddenly they were kind of wondering where they could get more hours for me to spend on me. And I was looking, where can I make more hours to be available? Because it's really, really fun. They have me doing basically this all the time.
Awesome. Okay. Awesome. Okay. Any other tools you wanted to mention, or any other questions?
Oh, totally. If nobody has any more ADMF questions, I have a few more recent updates to share on Fred's being lazy at PowerShell side of things. All right.
A new module for mixing cocktails?
No, not yet.
Ah.
I'm working with the local Chaos Computer Club association. They have got a cocktail mixing robot, and it's controlled by Raspberry Pi. So we are going to be building a PowerShell module for that. But since they can no longer gather at the moment, this is probably going to be stalled for about a year. But
Okay.
if you are attending probably 2022 Chaos Computer Club Summit, we're probably going to be showing it off.
Okay.
All right. Fred has a fun module called String. String has the objective to make your life easier. What we already know in PowerShell is that we've got operators, and operators can do all kinds of things. For example, we've got the split operator that allows us to, split on, let's split on a white space. There are several problems with that. Problem number one, the features are not well documented and discoverable. For example, who knew that you can just add (2) and define in how many pieces it will split things? It's a bit of a problem, because if it's not discoverable, odds are you don't know about it. And the second issue I have of that is that it's not pipeline capable. So we can't just go and do split, because now it will assume it's a parameter of select object. So now we need to do this. Ugly. We don't want to do that. All right. What can we do to help with that? With the string module, we now have corresponding split string command that allows us, hey, I want to split it on a white space. And I can see, for example, the count parameter, and I get comment-based help on that. Of course, we can also do get substring. One of the less well-documented things, it is also a trim. one feature that of PowerShell many people don't know, when PowerShell tries to resolve a command, and if it doesn't have a verb like just substring, it automatically looks for the command of the get verb. This works for every single command out there. So do we have any useful? Yes, we have. I can run content test.ps1 and it will run get content on that. Why? Well, it automatically looked that up. And the same works with substring. Of course, if I want to trim things, I want greater convenience or more intuitive name. One of the commands is format string. This works like the format operator. Those of you who don't know that, now, if you don't forget the comma, it actually works. The format operator allows us to insert values into strings. And of course, there is a format string command that allows us to do the same. Only in this case, we now have the property value and can choose what property we want to format into it. So I want the attributes and the name.
Whoa. Okay.
Of course, I could instead also do something less useful. With that, it will, as you can see, gather up 2 items and use the full item instead of the property. Unless they specify the property. So let's take the full name. Let's split it by the character S and into maximum 2 parts. And then let's format it into. And note this is not going to produce a useful result, but with this, we basically reversed each item as it was split. At least that was the idea behind the whole thing. Did I actually mess that up? Because it kind of looks that way. There's something out here. Fred, this didn't work out the way you intended it to. Oh well, another bug to fix, but that's okay. Yeah. Anyway, lots of fun commands here. One thing to consider: it's currently under deliberation whether this is going to be integrated into PowerShell 7.1. As you might notice, all of these are commandlets, not functions. And this module actually does not depend on the PowerShell framework, making it one of the very few modules I built that does not. And it allows you to basically operate against strings on the pipeline. All right. Yeah, I'm a total fan of that. 2 new commands coming to this as soon as you can make the time. And that's going to be compress string and expand string, using zip compression to compress strings.
Okay. I think that most of us are muted because of the background of the work from home, but a compress string, expand string, could you elaborate on that?
I'm going to use zip compression to reduce the size of the string. Imagine you want to transfer a large XML file to a REST API endpoint. Uncompressed, this XML data is way too huge. You can run export CLI XML on a dir, and it can run up to hundreds of megabytes. You don't want to send that over the network if you don't have to, and XML is a great candidate for string compression. So rather than file compression, this will do in-memory compression and uncompression. Another scenario where that's useful, by the way, is when you try to export to file, because disk I/O is the slowest part of writing to file. So if you can reduce the overall string size, that's more space saved. All right, which leaves us with one more update, and that is PSUtil. PSUtil is the module I used to make my life more easier. Originally, my PowerShell profile was a bit more than 5,000 lines of code in my profile. All the utilities I decided I needed to make my life more convenient. So great, but it's not that great if you need to work on multiple machines and if you need to keep it in sync and things like that. It's kind of nasty. So at some point, I decided to turn it into a PowerShell module. And thus was born PSUtil. PSUtil has a few fun commands. There's a full session on that somewhere recorded, I believe, but doesn't matter. For my convenience, exp expand PSU object will just take the default property. It also is, of course, tab completion into what property you want to export. Think of it as like select expand object, select object expand property, just default the typing. Nice enough. Yeah, it has a new version recently released, and it has 2 new features, which I kind of wanted to do for some time, but never made the time to actually happen. For one thing, it has a command now called outPSU variable, which allows you to store the result of a pipeline into a variable without having to jump to the beginning of the pipeline. And since this is a convenience thingy, this is the alias. Other than that, we have now tab completion and useful tab completion for a lot of the built-in commands.
Isn't it the same as the parameter dash out variable?
It absolutely is, only it does not spill the output onto the console. If you use out variable parameter, it will also be spilled onto the console. And if you've got hundreds of files, that's gonna massacre your screen.
Got it.
Also, it's easier when you've got like huge script blocks for each multi-lines for each loop. And let's be honest, we're not talking about a rocket science command here. This is the entire source code. And that is the command without the aliases.
Nice and easy.
In case you're wondering, Shift-Alt-Q expands aliases in PSUtil. Because I can't not use aliases and people kind of get confused when I'm presenting about them, so I'm trying to avoid that. Anyway, as mentioned, we've got tab completion for the incoming property names. This is less spectacular in PowerShell 7, but PSUtil is also available on Windows PowerShell. And the fun thing here, it also knows variable content, which the Windows PowerShell version definitely does not detect. What else do we have? We've got the knowledge management, which is the last feature of the update, which allows us to write down some snippets. And there we go. Now we've got knowledge, and with knowledge, we can read knowledge. And of course, we can search for tags. And there's this mysterious online switch. Which allows you to redirect your search directly to Wikipedia. And yeah, that's pretty much it for recent ongoings. I will in the near future have something fun for MS Graph, which is another customer project that I get to publish. And in case you haven't known about it yet, there's a PowerShell module called Microsoft Graph.graph, which is a really neat way to run to execute against Microsoft Graph. It's from Microsoft. If you actually hit enter on this, it'll take eternities because there's a huge list of dependencies. It's similar to running install module AZ, since this is basically the wrap around every single Graph API endpoint that Microsoft Graph has. If you have to work against Microsoft Graph, this is cool. And with that, I think I've talked enough for today.
Okay, I've got one question out of the topic right now. As I reminded myself something. Do you use Cloud Shell?
No.
Okay, I wanted to ask how you can install and import the module in a Cloud Shell, because not everything was working out there. Since you mentioned Microsoft Graph, and it was the first thing that popped my mind.
Sorry, I just always connect from on-prem, from
Okay.
my notebook.
And back for the PSU tool, the knowledge, where does it being stored? I mean, is it a variable in a profile, user profile?
It's a JSON file in your app data, which you can totally redirect using PowerShell Framework configuration system to point at a GitHub repository, so you can share it amongst multiple machines.
So anyone working in the same environment can just add knowledge, and it will be transferred directly into the GitHub repository.
Yes. And because that's not quite fun enough, because you would have collisions that way, there's a parameter called book that basically allows you to create multiple files. One book is a file. And you can also, using configuration, define what your default book name is. So you don't have to specify the book parameter, actually. You could, for example, do a team share and point it at the same network share or at the Git repository. What I do on my machine is actually I've got one book per computer from which I work to avoid the conflicts. And read has access to all books you have available. That is all files in the same folder.
So it's kind of OneNote without OneDrive hassle thingy.
That would be knowledge default book and library path. Yes, for values of yes. It's mostly for me to be able to index and dump some random pieces of PowerShell knowledge, because OneNote and things like that just don't work for me. Being able to access that from the console live is way better for me.
If you could use Microsoft Graph to update data in OneNote from the console with a JSON object, for example.
Again, please.
So, for example, you've typed an object. I mean, it was a here string. So if you could move that into MS Graph function that would update thing in OneNote online, just a wrapper for Microsoft Graph
That would totally
API.
work. That might be a fun extension. Actually, one of the things I've been considering is like making this extensible like a knowledge provider.
Mhm.
So that you could write it to JSON, that you could write it to OneNote and on the OneNote Online, that you could write your own logic for what works best for you. That would actually be quite nifty.
Yeah, I imagine
Okay,
getting data from AD, then using your select string to trim the output, and then the write output to the OneNote directly, for example.
I must admit, at that point, when I start implementing that, it's going to be standalone module. But no guarantees. I've got a huge backlog of things I really want to do, and this is more a convenience.
A lot of stuff to chew on, especially the PS framework, the Active Directory framework. You showed us some goodies today, that's for sure. I mean, we've been chatting with Tomek behind the scenes about the AD framework, the ADFM1, how to implement it. That is why we asked if it's possible to export the configuration or get the sample data for each entry. But it definitely has some value in our environment as well. So that's an awesome piece of work.
Oh, right, while we're on that topic, there's one last thing I actually forgot to mention. These property names, at the moment, they're case sensitive. This is a bug in a command used in PS Framework. It's going to be fixed in the next release, but until then, it's case sensitive.
Okay, kind of PS7 theme.
Mm-hmm. What?
It's kind of PS7 theme, so PowerShell 7, so Linux-based .NET Core. Say kind of case
actually,
sensitive.
let's call it what it is. It was a bug, and I'm going to fix it. But until then, it's case sensitive.
Okay.
I did not have any Linux style aspersions because, quite frankly, I think case insensitivity is one of the greatest features of PowerShell. Because I always mess that up.
True. I don't know who thought that two files with the same name, just different casing, are different files, but hey. Anyway, looking at the participants, any questions? If there are any questions, just shoot it away on the chat if you cannot unmute yourself because of the background. If you can, just ask Fred. Okay, I see no questions. Thank you very much, Fred, for what you've shown us in here today, joining us, and thank you for the remote session. I'm not sure if it would be possible for you to travel to Wrocław, especially in these times, and thanks to Teams, we could get the Teams online meeting. So thank you again. Hopefully we will see each other in PSConf this year. If not, probably some more online meetings on the schedule.
Probably.
Anything else you'd like to add at the end? This is right now.
No, had a great time. Thank you for having me over.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks all the attendees. Cheers, and see you on the next meetup. It will be in April about PowerShell 7. Thank you, Fred, again.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye bye.